Happy New Year from all of us here at Second Wind, and particularly those of us at the backdrop. Now the clock may just have switched from 2024 to 2025, and it's got us in a little bit of a reflective mood.
What year is this?
But it seems like this holiday season we're not the only ones looking backwards. After all, last year saw the release of a Todd Phillips Joker movie starring Joaquin Phoenix. A quote-unquote live-action Lion King movie, although perhaps the better term is reanimated. And the announcement that the next two big Avengers movies would star both Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. There's a clear and concerted effort on the part of the major studios to recapture the magic of 2019. However, there's also a sense that this is impossible. After all, Mufasa opened to a fairly underwhelming $35 million at the domestic box office. While it fared better internationally with a global taking of $122 million, Barry Jenkins' prequel is still very firmly in the shadow of Jon Favreau's The Lion King, which opened to $192 million domestic and $544 million worldwide in 2019. While Mufasa has the luxury of Christmas release corridor and, as of the recording of this, has already made $350 million, it seems highly unlikely the prequel will match the $1.6 billion global gross of Jon Favreau's film. So this week, in the spirit of the transition from one year to the next, we're going to take a look at why studios are so invested in recapturing the magic of 2019, how that's working out for them so far, and why you can't just recreate that magic by recycling existing intellectual property. And that's right, we're going to party like it's 2019. And look, when it comes to discussing 2019, hindsight is 2020.
Please kill me.
Of course, Mufasa is not the only follow-up to a 2019 smash hit to underperform at the box office recently. Yet Acosta's The Marvels grossed a mere $206 million, which was disappointing compared to its predecessor's $1.1 billion gross.
Is that like a personal attack or something? Or...
Todd Phillips' Joker Folie à Deux Electric Boogaloo also earned that exact figure of $206 million, also disappointing compared to the original's $1 billion gross. That said, given how aggressively Folie à Deux trolled its audience, that's actually quite an impressive box office haul.
As I got the sneaking suspicion that we're not giving the people what they want.
This market decline in sequel grosses extends arguably even beyond 2019. James Wan's Aquaman, for example, was a huge smash when it opened in December 2018, but it grossed a significant portion of its $1.1 billion gross in early 2019. In contrast, the sequel, a literal wet fart of a movie that was released in December 2023, which somehow decided to close the DCU with a reference to the opening of the MCU and also a scene where Patrick Wilson eats a bug.
I am Aquaman.
Mufasa'd its way to a relatively disappointing $439 million box office gross. Hell, even the sequels to the more modest hits of 2019 have seen a sharp decline in their box office revenue over the past couple of years. David F. Sandberg's Shazam, for example, saw an impressive haul of $365 million, but its follow-up Shazam! Fury of the Gods earned an appreciably weaker $134 million. In 2019, Downton Abbey grossed a total of $194 million worldwide, but the follow-up Downton Abbey A New Era earned less than half of that with a total global gross of $92 million. And look, it's worth acknowledging that at least some of the upcoming sequels to 2019 projects will perform very well indeed. Given how much Disney has riding on their success, it would be foolish to bet against Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars, which will reunite Endgame directors and Grey Man auteurs the Russos with Endgame stars Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans. The two announced follow-ups to Frozen 2 seem likely to be massive hits for Disney that will allow the studio to print money. Still, in general, studios have struggled to sequelize the success of 2019. Of course, there's a reason to treat 2019 as a baseline for these comparisons. It was, at least commercially, a miracle year for mainstream cinema. Global box office revenue hit an all-time high of $42.5 billion in 2019, up from $41 billion in 2018, $40.6 billion in 2017, $38.6 billion in 2016, $38 billion in 2015, and you don't need me to continue with this trend. Disney was a major beneficiary of this box office bump, earning $11.1 billion over the course of the year. To put that in perspective, Disney made more money in the first 7 months of 2019 than any studio had made in any year ever. Looks like Thanos wasn't the only one seeing green, if you know what I mean. I mean when the Hulk punched him, which I know technically comes from Avengers Infinity War, which was actually a 2018 movie, not a 2019 movie, but yeah, just go with it. Disney also became the first studio to ever have 7 movies gross over $1 billion in a single year. Every year since 2019 has existed in the shadow of 2019. End-of-year box office reports inevitably remind readers of how far Hollywood stock has fallen the past half-decade. The box office for 2021, for example, was down 61% from 2019. The results for 2022 lagged around 34% from 2019. By comparison, domestic box office in 2023 saw a drop of roughly 21% from 2019's $11.4 billion. Last year was, at least at time of recording, down 24% from 2019. Of course, if we're gonna talk about this, it's worth conceding that a lot has happened since 2019. There was a massive global pandemic that shut down theaters. Studios threw billions of dollars into the black hole mark streaming, causing irreparable damage to the theatrical model as a whole and destroying most of the secondary market. The industry was disrupted by massive strikes late in 2023. Hell, audiences have fallen out of the habit of going to cinemas, and there is simply not the same diversity of kind of movies to lure them back. However, even setting aside the huge question marks of a massive global pandemic and the self-inflicted wound of the streaming revolution, studios were always going to have a tough time following the financial success of 2019. Industry analysts noted that, even without foreknowledge of the disruption of theatrical shutdowns, box office was always going to struggle, and that Disney were always going to have, quote, a more subdued year at the box office in 2020. And I think we have a serious contender for understatement of the millennium there. As such, it is frankly insane to try to make any direct financial comparison between 2024 and 2019. However, it also glosses over the fact that the box office success of 2019 did not happen in a vacuum, and so cannot be magically conjured into being again by simply recycling old material. The record-breaking box office performance of 2019 was the result of years of steady momentum building, of developing franchises and building audience trust through years of grind. And I know that talking about the MCU in this context can feel like kicking a dead horse, but it is important in understanding what happened. 3 of the top 10 highest-grossing movies of 2019 were part of the MCU: Captain Marvel, Spider-Man Far From Home, and Avengers Endgame. Each of these movies grossed over $1 billion apiece. However, these were the culmination of a series that began 11 years earlier with Jon Favreau's Iron Man. Audiences had grown up with these movies, so of course they turned out for the grand finale. However, the early years of the MCU weren't anywhere near as financially lucrative for the studio as the late 2010s would be. The original Iron Man, for example, grossed a grand total of $585 million worldwide, placing just 8th at the global box office in 2008. That was a significant success for the young franchise. The Incredible Hulk, for example, earned a mere $264 million worldwide. Thor made $449 million worldwide, and Captain America: The First Avenger took in $370 million worldwide. Even Iron Man 2, the big success of that phase of Marvel movies, tapped out at $623 million worldwide. However, these movies served to build an audience. They demonstrated the studio could be relied upon to make good movies featuring characters that the audience was not necessarily already familiar with. And those viewers were then funneled into the crossover event of the Avengers, and then towards the culmination of the Infinity Saga in Avengers Endgame. The success of Captain Marvel, Spider-Man Far From Home, and Avengers Endgame was a result of a decade of work. More than that, these films were positioned as part of the, quote, series finale to the shared universe, the big climax of an epic story.
Iron Man.
That is why the audience showed up in droves. This felt like an ending. It was an off-ramp. It wasn't just the MCU. Some of the year's other big hits had a similar feeling of finality to them. The Rise of Skywalker, for example, rounded out the Star Wars sequel trilogy. It, Chapter 2, concluded the epic adaptation of Stephen King's masterpiece. How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World rounded out a trilogy of beloved animated films. Even Toy Story 4 sold itself on the promise that, following the seemingly final Toy Story 3, this really marked the end of the road with these characters. This pervasive sense of finality even applied to some of the films that weren't sequels. Disney had spent the better part of a decade converting its beloved Disney Renaissance animations into pseudo-live action. but it had cycled through most of the classics by the time it landed on Aladdin and the Lion King. There was perhaps a sense that there were only so many more of these sorts of projects left to be done. After all, did anybody want to see a quote-unquote live-action version of Mulan or The Little Mermaid? By the way we have the box office results, the answers are not really. In hindsight, 2019 felt like a gigantic farewell tour to the forces that had dominated pop culture during the 2010s. It's ill that so many of the more successful sequels within the past couple of years have been to movies within the last decade or so. In 2023, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny flopped at the box office, perhaps because younger audiences had no real connection to a franchise that was over 40 years old. In contrast, John Wick Chapter 4 and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 felt like satisfying grace notes to wrap up franchises that had launched just a decade earlier in 2014. In 2024, Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine were sequels to films from 2015 and 2016 respectively. They were cashing in on nostalgia for things that an audience would actually remember. Hell, even in the same weekend that Mufasa flopped at the box office, it was handily defeated at the domestic box office by Sonic the Hedgehog 3, another anthropomorphic animated animal franchise aimed squarely at the family demographic. However, Mufasa was old news. It was a prequel to a remake of a 3-decade-old film. Sonic the Hedgehog, on the other hand, is a much younger cinematic franchise. The first film in the trilogy hit theaters in February 2020. Of course, younger viewers flocked to see something that appealed to them and their experience of going to the cinema. This is the dirty little secret to cashing in on nostalgia. There has to be something for audiences to be nostalgic for. Studios have spent the past 2 years engaged in relentless cultural fracking, trying to desperately extract any remaining value from existing intellectual property. There's been no room to let anything new or interesting grow and develop, perhaps because the business is so fundamentally broken that movies performing like Iron Man or Thor or Captain America the First Avenger would be considered failures today. Take, for example, Joker Folie à Deux. In a vacuum, $206 million is actually a pretty decent performance for an R-rated courtroom drama musical that seems to hate both its audience and its very existence.
I can't be who you want me to be. It was all just a fantasy.
There is no Joker.
It certainly outperformed musicals like West Side Story or Mean Girls. Had the film been budgeted responsibly, even at a modest increase from the $55 million budget of the original Joker, it could have been a decent money spinner for Warner Brothers, instead of a complete financial catastrophe because somehow this cost $200 million. Indeed, for all the complaints about Sony's knockoff Spider-Man films, they're more sustainable than Disney's tentpole productions. Despite bombing in cinemas twice, even Morbius turned a profit for Sony because the studio kept the budget under control. Because less spending means more profit. Venom: The Last Dance might only have made $475 million at the global box office, but a modest budget of $120 million means that it likely made more for Sony than the $88,000 Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania earned for Disney in profit. But hey, who am I to tell Disney how to run their operation? They're making literally thousands of dollars over there. This is the secret of profitability that Hollywood has seemingly forgotten. Studios would invest a reasonable amount of money in a diverse portfolio of films. Sure, some of them would flop, but if they're budgeted responsibly, their failure wouldn't be a financial catastrophe. Those films that succeed develop into franchises, growing their audience through theaters, streaming, home media, television. Then, in about 5 to 10 years, you cash in on a grand finale that brings audiences to theaters and makes a ton of money. Franchising is like farming. Fields have to be left fallow and crops have to be rotated. The seeds of a bountiful harvest are grown over time with modest investment. In this way, studios have a constant cycle of properties earning a steady stream of revenue. The magic of 2019 was that all of these crops could be harvested at once. Of course, this idea of developing and growing and modestly investing doesn't align with shareholders' priorities. And instead of using this tried and tested method that has worked for decades, studios have resorted to just trying to recycle the successes of 2019 in the most literal manner imaginable. Still, there is hope. Despite all this anxiety over the state of the global box office right now, modestly budgeted films have proven remarkably resilient. Alien Romulus made $350 million worldwide on a budget of $80 million. A Quiet Place Day One earned $261 million worldwide on a budget of $67 million. Osgood Perkins' Longlegs made $126 million worldwide on a $10 million budget. Huh, I guess it really did have long legs.
What are the odds?
If spending on these films is kept under control, these projects can be financially lucrative for the studios producing them and the theaters screening them. This is perhaps the key to understanding what is happening at the moment. The massive financial success of 2019 was the culmination of a steady growth across the better part of a decade, seeding franchises and cultivating audiences. Hollywood needs to reconnect with a new generation and build franchises that speak to them over the next couple of years. Trust needs to be re-established, and it won't come if studios keep serving reheated leftovers of older generations' favorite meals. The post-pandemic box office certainly feels closer to the start of the 2010s than to the end of the decade. The $33.9 billion total in 2023 and the $30.5 billion estimated total for 2034 compare well enough to the $31.8 billion total in 2010, the $32.6 billion total in 2011, and the $34.7 billion total in 2012. The industry is recovering from a series of incredibly disruptive events, some of which are entirely their own fault, some of which are due to factors outside of their control. Given the fallout that came from chasing the massive success of 2019, there's an argument that the industry should prioritize sustainability over immediate revenue, even if that doesn't satisfy shareholders and stock reporters. Still, the relative box office disappointment of Mufasa is just the latest reminder that studios cannot magically make it beat 2019 again, no matter how hard they might wish, no matter how many sequels they might greenlight. As ever, it feels like studios have taken the wrong lessons from their own successes. That is perhaps the true circle of life. I've been Dara Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.